I can't remember what the matching actions were, but there was a scene of Amir Khan's character doing something creative with either the class or with Ashan, parallel with the tennis competition. And the father was yelling and cursing, and then it would cut back, and Amir Khan's character was, working with Ashan or working with a student. And then at the end, did you notice that it wasn't until they were all painting that the teachers who were, they were very, they were all about discipline, and they were stern. It was like once they all started expressing themselves, it created this environment of we're all accepting of each other.
And accepting of the fact that, like, some of us excel in these areas, some of us don't excel. Because that was part of it. Like, all the teachers did a bad job. That was one of the main themes I was getting through the movie, which I thought was really beautiful, is that, like, just because he's good at this and you're not good at that is not an issue, because you're good at this. Like, you have all these skills and, like, potential in different areas.
Yeah.
It's, like, kind of like that. I think it's you might have heard it, Braden, like an Einstein quote where he said, or I think both of you might have heard it, where he says, if you judge a fish on its on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking it's stupid. You know what I'm talking? Like, I was
that is like the encapsulation of this movie.
Yes. That's the I was wondering. Yeah, the whole time I was watching it. Yeah, it's the film version of that quote almost.
And it's always cool. So we checked out a movie. It reminded me of this. We checked out a movie, I think third week, called Triplets of Belleville, and it was
incredible.
So good. You should watch it. It's a French animated movie. But it's a story, I think, about filmmaking. But it's told through the lens of this character's just solely focused on bike riding. But it reminded me of that because I feel like this was Amir Khan's, in a way, there's more going on than just this, but his love letter to creativity and just being expressive and having ideas and following passions. And as a person who hopes to be creative for the rest of my life, that's always an inspiring thing to me when you can write a story about being creative. You can be creative and write a story about creativity. That's always just... It's
a very vulnerable spot to come from.
No, agreed. Yeah. And that's the thing. We talk about this a lot in our personal lives. It always feels like this is the beauty of filmmaking, is you feel heard, and because for those who aren't creative out there, there's nothing wrong with not being creative, but we talk about it a lot. It's just like it's a different thing when you're talking about filmmaking. You're talking about writing, or you're talking about somebody who wants to be a musician. It's not the type of thing where it's like, I have plan A that I want to make music, but then like plan B is like I go to law school or whatever.
Want to be an accountant.
Yeah, exactly. For us, I can't speak for you, obviously, but it's always just like, this is it. I just want to be creative. Like that's the end goal. There is no plan B. And so it's always nice to watch somebody who it feels like they get that. You know what I mean? And they're telling a story about that.
And especially with like this profession specifically, if you wouldn't rather live under a bridge than not do what you're doing, then you're kind of better off doing it as a hobby anyway.
Yeah.
So I think that is really important too.
What's the Scorsese quote where he said, if you're in this business to make money, you're in the wrong business. But if you're in it to tell a story that you can't sleep because you got to tell a story, then I may be talking to you. Yeah. And that's just it, man.
That was his master class, which is a great master class, by the way.
Johnny G bought that for me for our first Christmas as buds. It was a beautiful thing.
It's a great master class.
It was, yeah. I don't think we've finished it, but from what we've watched, it was incredible.
So good.
He goes into very. He has a very theological way of approaching filmmaking, which is really interesting. He doesn't really go into like the technical aspect of it. He goes into like the thematic aspect of it. Anyway, that's beside the point.
One thing with the writing that I was going to bring up that I thought was interesting is like even a character that does by societal expectations excel. Like what his brother's name was it Johann?
I think so.
Yeah. Like with Johann, there's the scene where the father is freaking out, getting mad at him during the tennis match. But like Johann is like the first in his class in almost every subject, which just kind of shows there's like all these pegs that, especially children in America. But I feel like sometimes in America it's trying to be normalized. Like I feel like there's a big push to normalize letting kids excel in their own areas, which sometimes does and sometimes doesn't work out. But I thought it was interesting just showing that. Like his dad in that moment of freaking out on him because he's not winning the tennis match is not thinking about the fact that his son is like very much like him. He has an incredible work ethic. He's brilliant. He's the top in every area of his class. And it just kind of shows like the father's mindset, which I thought was interesting because that was one thing. Like the father is supposed to be shown throughout the movie as a large antagonist. I never really felt like he hates Ishan. I just felt like he doesn't understand Ishan and he doesn't have the willpower, or not the willpower, but he's not thinking enough about how he's conducting himself around his son is affecting his son. He just wants his son to act, which kind of made me. I felt like it was kind of a layered character, and it kind of made me feel bad for him because, like, there were several moments where I was just like, you just need to step back and like look at this situation from afar and see how you're conducting yourself and how that might be coming across to your children, how it might be, you know.
Yeah.
And I also think that comes from a standpoint of culture, right? So, you know, I would say that, especially like even here in like the 1950s, you're raised, and even people now, you're raised to, you know, you have to respect your father. You have to, you know, the father is the alpha of the house, and you must do what he says. And he kind of comes, Sean's dad kind of comes from that perspective of, you know, that old school style of raising kids. Yeah. But I don't think that works for Ishan, and that doesn't work for, you know, I think that almost has to do with, I wonder if Amir Khan kind of took his upbringing into the writing of this movie, because you can definitely tell that there is some father-son issues in the writing of this movie. Yeah. And I think that relationship between the father and Ishan is really important to recognize, because that is probably a situation a lot of kids growing up go through.
For sure. I mean, we all three have different backgrounds. I'm positive about that. I come from a really small town, really conservative area. And I mean, dude, like, you know, mental health, you know, I remember my brother got diagnosed clinical OCD when he was, I think, 4 or 5. And like, we got a lot. I remember growing up, Spencer was in therapy at, you know, 6 or 7 and medicated at 6 and 7. And I think that's a great decision on my parents' part. We got weird looks because what you're talking about, that old school mentality of, and I think he made it a point, or the writers made it a point that he said several times, like, are you saying there's something wrong with my son? Mm-hmm. And I think that was a beautiful little metaphor to explain that sentiment of just like, Sean's like, you know, basically trying to read a different language. It's not that he, you know, there's something wrong with him. He's just different than others, which is what we're talking about.
He has a different approach on life.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think a lot of, old school parenting, I think that's something that probably wasn't focused on. I know in the case of my upbringing, the people that were surrounded, that were in, you know, my parents, again, thankfully, were very healthy, had a healthy approach to it. But the people I saw, what was modeled in front of me, that was typical, where it's just like, there's nothing wrong with my son. Yeah. And actually, shoot, I had a train of thought. Were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, as far as the old, like, traditional mindset of just demanding that there's nothing wrong with nothing wrong, I feel like it goes from it kind of comes from a place of like, if there's something wrong here, then there's a possibility that there's something wrong that I've done, so then I need to change my approach. Because like the talk that the parents had in the car with the Sean in the back seat, which was very realistic and very terrible parenting, talking about him like that, was beautiful. Mm-hmm. because the mom, and it showed like what you guys were talking about earlier, the mom was really trying to think of new approaches and think of different ways to come at it and think of different stuff, and the dad was just like, no, he's just being a pill. Like he's just, he's just being disobedient. We just need to send him somewhere where they give him a little more discipline and he'll be fine. And also with that, in that car ride, I thought it was a beautiful, or like not beautiful because it was kind of sad, but it was a good little piece of writing. Because like you notice that right after they've had this conversation with him, like with the parents about, hey, if your son can't shape up, like we're gonna have to kick him out of our school. They're driving, and all those kids come up to the car trying to sell magazines, and the dad like shoos them away and says something about just like, oh, little brats. And you got to kind of think of it just shows again how much he's saying, where he wasn't trying to, because you got to think about it, like if Ashawn gets kicked out of school, it's very likely that will be his future, like one of those kids that's running up selling magazines.
Yeah.
And so it shows that he doesn't realize, I don't think he realizes throughout how much the stuff he's saying is affecting his kids. But it shows what he thinks about uneducated children, which is why he refuses, instead of thinking like, oh, maybe there's something wrong here and there's a way I can change my approach. Just like, no, my son just needs a little more discipline and he'll be just like Johan. When him and Johan are two different children. I should have brought it up in the directing scene also, but did you guys get any Guy Ritchie vibes from the montage of the dad getting ready to go up and like, or getting ready to go on his business trip, and then Johan waking up and getting ready for school, and then cutting to a slow. Because it was all just like fast-paced music, fast cuts. I loved that scene. It might have been one of my standout scenes from the movie.
That was really creative. That's the thing you made reference to earlier. There are like several scenes that felt like music videos, which I'm glad you said that, because I actually thought when I was watching, it made me wonder if the director had a background in shooting music videos. Because some of them just felt like music videos, but that's an example.
And that one showed did well because it was earlier in the movie. Did a great job showing how similar the dad and the son were, and then like, okay, let's slow it down as Ishan like wakes up, and it like brought to pace
it's a great point.
Similarities betwing them and the differences between them.
It's a great point. That train of thought that I lost, by the way, which ties into what this conversation. I think so. About a year or so ago, I got a puppy, and let me preface: I'm not comparing, humans to dogs, but I think it was interesting when I was like reading about how to take care of the puppy. The person I was reading said that dogs are like humans in the way that we're both habitual creatures, and the thing that they said is there's no such thing as a bad dog. So a dog isn't bad because it's bad. It's a product of its environment. So if you train a dog poorly, it is a bad dog. And that's the thing, and I want to dive deeper into it in just a second, but I wanted to bounce this guy off of you guys. The whole time I was watching that first act, it was very clear to me, Ashan's not a bad kid because he's a bad kid. He's a bad kid because he's being brought up in this crazy unhealthy environment. And so you did feel for him when he says, I don't want to go to boarding school. But a part of me was just like, you need to get out of there, dude. You need to get out of that environment because you're becoming a product of that unhealthy environment.
I know, but it also
it's kind of like the whole like strict parents make disobedient kids kind of thing. It's exactly that.
Yeah. And like that scene showed, it was just kind of sad because he's begging not to go. You as the viewer realize that like it might actually be good for you to go, but you got to think from his point of view. He sees it as just like, I can't figure this stuff out, so they don't like me anymore, so I'm being separated from them. Like they're sending me away because they don't want to deal with me anymore.
Yeah. Just again, there's so many ways. That's why it was so surprising to me, and it makes sense why it was on this list, because there are so many ways a cheaper script could have gone this route and made it so much less layered. But it just, again, it came off so realistically. So here's the big theme that I'm going to tell you guys how I perceived it, and then I want to bounce it off you guys and see what you think. Because it ties into both kind of the bigger themes that we've talked about so far. It reminded me, as we were getting to the end of the movie, I've done a lot of research into Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and it reminded me a lot of his approach to handling children, because he was really huge, not just with his show, just with child development. He was a big figure.
Yeah.